Good evening, everybody. This is Tim Cusick with Training Peaks. Glad to see so many of you joining us tonight. What a great turnout for our webinar. Tonight's webinar is going to be very special. We have a guest presenter, Dean Golich, who is a premier coach and he's the head of performance physiology for Carmichael Training Systems is with us. Dean works with some of the top pros in the world, works with different sports, some professional sports teams and people in motocross, NASCAR, and I actually happen to know he also works with Navy SEALs and some other things. He's a pretty diverse guy. His background in training and coaching is about as deep as they get. I also happen to know that Dean was one of the early adopters of power training, has been at this for a really long time, and is going to really give us a great show about bias and kind of how to establish a workflow that deals with bias and process and good coaching. Most of you have kind of been on our webinars before, so you know the question process. What'll happen is Dean is presenting, I'll work the question box. I might interrupt Dean at time to ask questions as we go, because I'm going to be reading your questions that you'll be asking throughout the presentation. You in your box, you have this little gray box, you have this arrow. Yours might be closed if your arrow is pointing to the left. You could always click on that, open this box, type your questions in here, and that shows up on my screen. When I type questions back, or if I type the response back, you'll see it in the response. Some I might type a response as Dean's speaking because I can just kind of deal with it and it's a good question, but not maybe one that we want to surface, and take up too much time. But if it put your questions in there when it's the right type of question or the right time, I'll sort of interrupt Dean. So just know I'll be like, Dean, stop him for a second, then ask that question. We do also have a question and answer period in the end, so you could always hold your question. I just know at times like you're seeing something, you're like, man, I just really want to understand that. And I hate when then you put that question in and then a half an hour later we get to it. So go ahead and answer your questions. I'll facilitate them as we go. So right now I'm going to turn it over to Dean to kick things off. So we're going to go through about 30 seconds of technology switch as we magically switch over to Dean's screen. So Dean, you should get a message and we now see your screen. If you go to full presentation mode, we'll know if you have the right screen. You do.
All right.
Looking great and rolling.
All right. So this is another one of the presentations that if I was, say, a younger coach, I probably wouldn't have watched it. Now that I'm older and I know all the mistakes I've made, the process becomes way more important than understanding some of the metrics. So I'm going to try to go through basically all the mistakes I've made over the last 20 years and try to formulate them into a process. And now I start all these presentations, virtually every presentation, whether technically, data, coaching, or so on, I start with the same 6 slides. And the way it starts is this one. If all we have is data, if we have data, let's look at data. If all we have are opinions, let's go with mine. And that's kind of the way I functioned for a lot of years until we got more data, more accurate metrics, and so on. And so to start the presentations, if you've seen this before, I'm sorry, but the point is that we're all biased. I have to understand that myself, and I have to reinforce that in myself all the time, that I'm plagued with false beliefs. Experienced professionals are plagued with them. Maybe some of the people that we look up to or our idols or mentors are also plagued with these biases. And so there's a quick little test. So again, you don't have to believe me, but we can do the test and then we can see if we're right. And so that test is called the Wasson selection test. So here's a quick little test for everyone. I won't go through everything, but the task is to determine whether all cards with a vowel on one side have an even number on the other. So obviously the vowel is the A and the even number being the 4. And so which 2 cards would you turn over to see if all cards with a vowel on one side have an even number on the other? So me, like most people, well, actually like 90% of the population will turn over the A and the 4. And herein lies the problem. And this is what we'll get to as we go through data and how I relate it to WKO4 and how I relate it to power training and in general, and then coaching as well, is that we're always trying to prove we're right. So then when we look back at data, say you do 3-minute intervals and you do a bunch of them and then an athlete performs well, well then you say it's because of the 3-minute intervals. You're trying to prove yourself right, when in reality that may not have been why the athlete or therefore your coaching produced a positive outcome. So if you chose the A and the 4, you're among the 90% of the people's minds get boggled by this task. That's because the A and the 4 are the cards that would only produce information consistent with the hypothesis you are supposed to be testing. But in fact, the cards you need to flip over are the A and the 7, because finding a vowel on the back of the 4 would tell you nothing about all cards. It would just confirm some cards. Whereas finding a vowel on the back of the 7 would comprehensively disprove your hypothesis. So this is common, and you can see it in all walks of life, and I find it more in coaching because there's always the statement, the art of coaching, the art of this, the art of that. And generally, I feel like that refers to something we don't understand, so we can't put a number to it. Or we know what the problem is, but we can't, it's so complex that we can't figure out how to put a number to it. So that's bias. So we have a tendency to draw firm, complete conclusions from incomplete information because we seek out and overvalue confirmatory information for any given hypothesis. So if 90% of the people fail to understand this evidence required, which is the same every time they give this test, whether it's to professionals, fitness, rehabilitation, virtually anyone who takes this test, and you can go online and just search Wasson selection test, and there's number tests, there's color tests, there's a variety of different tests that you can go through just so you can understand how you get some of this confirmation bias. So now that we've kind of gone through the first couple slides, we know we're biased, we put a number to the bias, and so we're going to try to eliminate that. So to eliminate that, the way you start with a step of what information needs to be collected. So before we get down the WKO4, or say for a TSS or a mean maximal, you have to understand, what am I trying to find out? Is it power? How long a power? Is it aerobic? Is it, and so on and so forth. And then the next way to eliminate bias is only go towards your expertise. So for example, and we'll get more into this, but this is how, if someone knows a lot about physiology, then that's where they should use their expertise, and that eliminates the bias. If you don't understand tactics in a bike race, then you shouldn't use your physiology to go into the tactics of a bike race, or else you create a lot of bias. The other thing is that if the hypothesis is derailed, is that hypothesis then that you said, if I have 3-minute power and I increase my 3-minute power, then I'm going to be better. And I tell that to everyone on this webinar. So then we go and say we poll everyone, we're working on a project together of everyone on this webinar. If you know my hypothesis is 3 minutes makes you better, then that opinion leads everyone around there into the wrong direction, because I've given you that bias. So the point is why WKO4 will probably be so successful in the future is that if you work at home or wherever in your office and you're working on WKO4 independently, and then you bring those independent thoughts into the group, then we have eliminated a lot of the bias. And it's already developing that way. So someone may create a chart or a workflow, and then I may copy it, but then I don't know what their bias was or why they created it. I just know that, oh, that happens to agree with what I was looking at, and then I'm going to edit it a few times to shape it towards what I was looking at. And we'll go, and again, we'll go through all this listed. So that's one way that I feel like the WKO4, the way the function is with the chart exchange, how you can get other people to email the charts, and then the Facebook, social media, and so on, is that we're all independently working on something, and then we'll come together as a group and then go back independently, and that will eliminate a lot of the bias that will be developed if we worked at it as a group. The other thing is when you're creating a chart, there might be a way to, one of the things to eliminate bias is to list the things that you've explained the way. So again, back to our previous example, if we're in 3-minute power, well, we're going to eliminate 2-minute, 1-minute, 30-second, and so on. And because we know that, we're going to explain away those things. The second part with the social media, the last bullet point there with the social media, is that you can include the gossip of decision making and thus critique others. So the news groups, Facebook, and all those things, as much as maybe we don't like them in social settings, in a work product setting here with WKO4, I would encourage you guys to go there, because the gossip or of that decision making and critiquing others is positive for all of us, because we've created the chart or an individual metric by ourselves, and then we went to the group, everyone critiques each other, as out of hand as it may get sometimes, but that is a positive towards the decision making. So that's the way we try to eliminate it, and some of this is already built in WKO4 without design. I'm sure you don't put up a Facebook page just for decision making and eliminating bias, but you do put it up to get the word out. So now when we're going from, say, WKO3, I mean, I started with, this is 20 years ago, with just the SRM software, and then we built another software back in 1994 to 96 for Project 96 through EDS, a software company, or data systems analytics company. And then, so when you build those things and you're trying to manage complex change, we keep evolving some of these, some of the software that leads to coaching or leads to the end product of the data analyst. So here, this chart explains pretty much everything. If you got nothing out of it, this is how everything goes in coaching and business and so on. So if you have a vision, if you say, okay, I need to be able to train this person in triathlon, and I have these skills that I have in coaching, and then there's incentives that if I do this, this athlete wins, and then I have the resources of, say, that's where I would put WKO4, and then I have an action plan that says, okay, I'm going to start with 7 by 3 on, 3 off intervals tomorrow, then you can get change. If you don't have the vision, you get confusion. If you don't have the skills, you get anxiety. And I understand that when we've come on with WKO4 now, is that when you're trying to build some of the expressions and you're seeing what other people are doing, I would caution you against just taking on a metric and then say, does it fit within the standards, and then just go with it. Because everyone on this webinar, as in everyone who deals with WKO4, knows something that the rest of us don't. So when that gets built in, they end up having the expertise. So everyone has these skills. So whether they're in business and they can relate it to this, or they're stockbrokers or engineers or physicists, they can relate some of these things into the data that the rest of us haven't thought of. And therefore, we all get to a better answer towards something specific that we may or may not even know that we don't know. So then the next thing is incentives. You get it, people resist when they're not incentivized. If you don't have the resources, if you don't have in the past, when we created the first softwares, they did a few things, but prior to that, we used to get, the coaches got frustrated, physiologists got frustrated because mostly it was lab. Then we had some outdoor, power meter testing, but many people were frustrated because everyone had the vision, there was plenty of knowledge, everyone had the incentives that we were going to win, but we didn't have the resources. And now that we have, they've progressed dramatically, then you can get change. And then the last thing is the action plan, and that's where you have everything, but then you get the false starts. And that's where I am right now with WKO4, is I create, I steal, I cajole everyone into giving me their charts. I try to create my own, I adapt them, and then I just I need to create action plans to go with each one of those because I'm going off of, like I said, my previous bias, my previous experience, and I need to expand my horizons and change that. So here's kind of how now we're talking about coaching and how you use WKO4 in decision making and so on. So this is, we put intuition up here. And some would say it's psychology of coaching and so on, but just so when you're using WKO4, you should use your intuition if you have experience in that area. So if you've used TSS for a number of years, then you can say, well, roughly this person that I'm training has this TSS, and I feel like I either need to rest them or I need to train them harder, or there's a few things that go with the outcome of what your decision-making process. One way to make that even more clear is to what we say here in the middle is a pre-mortem. Instead of doing a post-mortem of where I went wrong, you're trying to find out why you're going to go wrong before it even gets there, and then that's where the intuition will work if you're an expert. So then on either side of that, you have the low validity and the high validity. So low validity is when things are turbulent and you may not be the expert at it, so you can't use your intuition. And maybe you need procedures or checklists. So for example, there's lots of airline fighter pilots and airline pilots in general where a lot of it is procedurally oriented. So you have a checklist, because you can't know everything about how a jet engine functions. So you have someone who's created a checklist for you because you're in a turbulent environment, so you go through the checklist. But if you've went through that specific engine failure before through experience, then you can use your intuition. And that's where maybe something isn't as turbulent to you, so that's when we'd go to the other side, which is the high validity. And that's when you can use your intuition. So that's why if you've coached for a long time with power, you can utilize a lot of the power, the mean maximal powers and so on. But if you haven't, then you need to go towards some of the standards that say if your FRC is over 16,000 16 kilojoules, then you know that you're in the top, above average, I guess is what I'm getting at. And so therefore that experience tells you that. If you don't know that, then you have to go to the standards to know if you're actually improving the athlete or yourself or whoever you're training for that. And one side note on that high validity and using your intuition is you need to delay intuition. So if you're a coach and you're at home and you're training someone, well, you can delay the response to the athlete before you make a value judgment, even with experience. The longer you can delay it and use your experience, the better the outcome. And then the more feedback, so for example, you may look at a TSS or intensity score or even the power duration curve and say, hey, wait, I've got this down. I've already improved this athlete in these time frames that we've trained. It's still good to call the athlete, or if it's yourself or someone, to get feedback to understand of what the next step is on the intuition side. So, and then again, I want to reiterate, in that intuition side, it's only in your area of expertise. So obviously we have to, be well-rounded and keep improving our numbers of the areas of expertise. But for right now, as you're progressing through WKO4, if you don't know a particular metric, then don't try to use your intuition or kind of that art of coaching if you don't understand it. But use it if you do understand it. So here's a little bit more on that checklist, and the information is you have to determine the quality of the independence of the information. So if right from the beginning we say it's 3-minute intervals, the athlete goes out and does 3-minute intervals, and we know that the power meter is accurate and so on and so forth, then you have a start with the checklist. You can fragment the problems and you say, okay, was the first interval good compared to the second interval? What's our normal fall off within the intervals? What was our rest between intervals? And so then you can start to keep the judgment independent as you fragment that training program and therefore the end result. And then correlated errors create conformity. So one of the famous, I guess it's psychological studies, is that if you put a jar of pennies in front of people or a group, and you start asking them how many pennies are in the jar, well, the conformity of the group, when someone makes a comment and then the next person makes a judgment, next person makes a judgment, pretty soon you conform out of the influence of the group, and it's less accurate. And then obviously in that experiment, then they take the jar and independently ask each person one by one without the others around, and therefore they're more accurate in their judgment or their estimation of how many pennies are in the jar. So this is good because this is WKO4. We can work on this alone, and then you go back to Facebook or these webinars and so on, and we get together in groups, and then we see where we are, and then you go back and work on it alone. And some of the charts are created independently, and then you work on them together. And so that's where you've got to make sure that you have the checklist of what you're going to look at. Like as a coach, you have to do the checklist of saying, okay, I create my performance manager chart. I look at it. Here's what I look at first. And then you have a checklist if it's not a turbulent environment. The further part of this intuition and decision making is this coaching and leadership that a lot of times, so if I get on here and I say, hey, FRC is this and this is what you have to do, well, a lot of times if I'm decisive in the way I communicate, then a lot of people will have confidence in me. And then I say, well, and here's what I did. I did these 3-minute intervals, and I'm saying this with confidence, and I produced this Olympic champion. I did it. They didn't do it, right? So I did this. I trained them. And so then other people say, well, this person's got confidence. And then we're using hindsight to reinforce me as a leader. So when you're working with WKO and how these charts are produced, they're kind of independent of this. And so when you're a leader or a coach, a lot of times you have to have confidence with an athlete, and a lot of times people judge your confidence on what you've done with someone else before, even though, again, those 3-minute intervals did not produce the Olympic champion, but I say they did, so some people think they did, and so I may be a terrible coach, but I'm going off of that reinforcement as a leader in hindsight. So I got lucky with a really good athlete that everything happened to come together and they got the medal, but now all of a sudden I'm an expert. This is where you want to find out you're wrong or prove you're wrong before you even get there. And a lot of times you can do this with your charts in a retrospective analysis, and I'll show you those charts later too. So then on the other side, if you're indecisive and you're sometimes analytics, you look at it and go, wow, it could be this, it could be that, it could be temperature, it could be wind, it could be altitude. Then a lot of people and athletes won't have confidence in you. But this is a weird turning point on when you're trying to coach someone, even if it's yourself, and you're trying to, the goal is the performance is to win the race. So if you're indecisive and you say something, even though correct, a lot of times the athlete and other people won't believe it, and so it's hard to come out with a positive outcome psychologically. So I just wanted to point those couple of things out. So when you make a decision, why are people excited about the decision? And then you've got to, like I said, come up with the ways that it can go wrong, and then you have to change the dynamic that it is positive to show potential problem. So in an athlete, when you talk back and forth, once you've built a decent relationship with an athlete, you can say, okay, tomorrow's intervals, you have to be careful for how you preface failure, right, psychologically. But on the other hand, you say, okay, wait, if it's hot, this, if it's cool, this. And so then you're trying to predict potential problems that then we can use our intuition and basically this mythical art of coaching to exact change. And so, and I want to just make sure I comment on the bottom there. In 2009, September, American Psychologist, Conditions for Intuitive Expertise, and that's that Kahneman and Klein. And Kahneman's a guy who wrote the Fast and Slow Thinking, and then Klein is the one who wrote the book Sources of Power. But some of what they're going back and forth on a lot of this is right there in that paper. So I would refer you to that to read the whole thing. It's quite interesting on how we look at data, how we look at problems, leadership, coaching, business, so on. So the next part is leaders, we as leaders, coaches, and so on, we don't want to put in procedures that question our judgment. But with WKO4, I think you have to do that or else you get lost. So if I only put 3-minute interval charts in there and I train at 3-minute intervals and I show improvement, therefore I'm the greatest in the world. But I didn't understand that 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and everything else went down. So that's when, as a leader, you have to put the procedures and the charts in that question the judgment. And you can do, now that we have some of this data, and a lot of you have the data from before, you can do, again, the retrospective part of it to see if what you said you were doing a lot of the time. In one part is as intensity increases, does your duration increase? One of the principles of training. And so when you go back and look at all your data, it's always interesting to see if what you said you were doing and what you were doing were the same thing. And then even if they weren't, did they produce results? And then back to the social media, and man, I am not a fan of social media, but you do not marginalize disagreement with you. The more disagreement you have, that's a positive, and you may be looking at it the wrong way that, hey, I know 3-minute intervals produce a higher VO2 max. Why is this person saying that? And there could be differences in whether the recovery is full, whether you don't give a full recovery. And so you have to understand that, because that is an advancement on whether you create a new chart or a new athlete view that will lead to a better performance and better analytics. So one way that I've always done this, and I didn't know it, but this is the way I look at it. So this is just an example. It's something that's positive or is very prominent in military circles, and it's called the OODA loop. And this Colonel John Boyd was a fighter pilot, and so he came up with most of this is in dogfighting analysis or air-to-air combat. And if you're in the military, everyone has seen this a million times. But the way, when I looked at this, and one time I was at a military installation and they were looking at some of these analysis of different procedures that they had, it makes perfect sense to me, and this is basically how I did all my analytics of power over the last 15 years. So this is just an example. You don't have to do it this way. I'm not suggesting you do it this way. I'm saying you need to come up with a way that is organized, legitimate, and successive in its procedure, to wherefore to then that it becomes, I guess, automatic in how you're looking at some of it. So anyways, observe, orient, decide, and act. So the observation could be the race, it could be a performance manager chart, and then the orient is, well, in this you get the analysis, you get some of the previous experience, you get new information, and then the decide is, okay, what am I going to do? Am I going to train more? Am I going to rest? And then the act is, then what do I tell the person, coach, the athlete, or so on? One of the key points here is at the decide point, you can always go back to the observe. So you can see at these certain times, you can always come back and feedback the observations. Now, it's interesting that a guy came up with this and made it as complex. It's very simple, but it's complex in how you can keep doing these feedback loops within the OODA loop, I guess is what you're saying. So I'll go through it. So there's 3 principles that roughly this is gauged on. So this Gödel's proof, this Heisenberg's uncertainty, and the second law of thermodynamics. So when we talk about that, it's any logical model of reality is incomplete. So when you look at a power file and you're going to analyze and create, just understand that it's never going to be right. And the more you get it right in one area, a lot of times the more it is uncertain in another area. And that's where the Heisenberg's comes in. And then the second law of thermodynamics is Boyd infers that individuals or organizations that don't communicate with the outside world by getting new information, they become a closed system and therefore increase disorder. So these things are kind of how we base some of it, but it's taken together. These 3 notions support the idea that any inward-oriented and continued effort to improve the match concept with observerality when only increase the degree of mismatch. So if we all get in our group and it's a closed group and we just keep talking and talking about the same thing, pretty soon there's more disorder. It's a closed system, and therefore we can't progress. And that's why I think this WKO4 for me has already been, I've already corrected some of my training even after 20 years, even things that I thought were reality. So again, we have the observe, orient, decide, and act. So in this Boyd's analysis, or the OODA loop, as the observation refers to all your senses. So in a bike race, you're going to come out there and you're going to go, okay, what's the competition? What's the environment? What are my aerodynamics? What do I eat? Where's the feed zone? So on and on and on. Orient is knowledge rests not upon the truth, but also the error. So it's okay to make mistakes, and I can say that now. At the beginning, I was so deathly afraid of making any mistakes that it probably paralyzed me from taking chances or getting sound improvement, because it's the status quo. But now we can actually measure some of that. So orientation, physical or mental, is fed by the raw data. And every item observed is where the information gathered is turned into knowledge. So this is where you kind of deconstruct things. Were there enough 3-minute intervals? Were the 3-minute intervals applicable to this race? And then the other person here is Dr. Gary Klein, and that's one of the article that I mentioned before. In high pressure decision situations, is that it's the experience that leads to some of that intuition or some of that positive outcomes in decision making. So then decide, the next process in the loop is making a decision which in that moment, however brief, decides to go through with a particular action. And so when you're coaching someone, it may be by data where we're sitting in front of the computer screen, you're talking, but it's also like right after the race, right before the race, do I go with this wheel for aerodynamics? Is the wind coming up? What do I do? What is the team going to do? Blah, blah, blah. And then act. In war, this is a war analogy and a military analogy, but in war there are but one favorable moment. The great art is to seize it. So a lot of times you'll see in classics that I have power files from classics over, say, the last 15 or 20 years. And a lot of times there's people who do not win the race that produce more power. Now that seems obvious, but I'm talking about people that have tactically rode the race, saved energy, had teammates, not the guy who rode out in the wind all day and then said, well, I produced more kilojoules and I had more power. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying of equal combatants or equal cycling athletes racing together, they produced more power, but they did it at the wrong time. And then they chased and actually produced more power and had higher kilojoules and on and on and on through just a small tactical error, or I don't know if it's a bravery of taking a chance. So that's part of it. Now, this is all explained in quite a long paper, but there's a paper called The Tao of Boyd by Brett and Kate McKay that's an interesting read that you can go through it. The reason I put it on there is this is kind of how I do it. So then when we observe, so I observe that this is a performance manager chart. So where the arrow is towards the last quarter of the file, there's a downward white arrow. It doesn't look like there's anything special. So there's the green dots are the 60-minute powers, the orange are the 3-minute powers, the reds are the 20-minute powers. And then you can see that generally this is where the TSB in yellow is. You have the chronic training load in kind of the darker bars behind, and then you have the blue line, which is the chronic intensity load, which I just found the other day. I forget who created this, but this is now, as of about 2 weeks ago, my go-to chart. So this is the arrow. So right there, you would look at this arrow and think, well, there's nothing special that happened. There's no big intensity, so there's no acute training load going up. The chronic training load's going down. The chronic intensity load is kind of maintaining, and there's no other exceptional. The way I look at it, there's nothing else exceptional. So then I go, say this is 8/21/15. That's the date of this file. You can see it at the bottom if you follow the arrow down to the bottom of the dates there. So 8/21/15. So I'm like, well, I'm going to go to 8/21/15. And so now I look at this file and I say, okay, this is a hill climb because you can see the data, or well, you can see the altitude in turquoise, yellow is the power, and then you have the I zone levels over it. So this is, I'm observing, I'm looking at what's going on in this file. And so, and then I put a trend line in that you can see yellow of what the file does, or what the power does over time. So now I orient myself. And the orient is, now I've taken this file and I've corrected it for altitude. So if I go back here and I look and I say, okay, that's a hill climb file, and then I look at the upper bar just under observe where it says elevation, that says 9,985 feet. So I know that this person is a sea level. So I've taken into account all these things. So I've observed this. Now I orient it. Now I correct it, because I've got to correct it, because when you go back to the original performance manager chart, you're right, nothing special stands out. But then as you go through it and you analyze it a little deeper, you've got to correct for the altitude, because obviously someone can't produce more altitude. So you can do this for heat, you can do it for aerodynamics, you can do it for a variety of different metrics to try to get you to assimilate all powers, all training loads, or all training stress scores, or whatever you deem is important through your expertise once you've eliminated your bias. So then to decide, I have a 3-minute, 10-minute, and a 5-minute chart here. So let's just look at the yellow here. And then I look at that yellow 3-minute power, or say I wanted the 20-minute power, whatever the length of that time trial or hill climb was. I would go and see where, adjusted for altitude, where that power would lie within my best, or my mean maximal powers. So once I've corrected for that, that's how I decide, was that a good effort or was that a bad effort? Or was, and that accounts for even if they won the race. So say that was a race hill climb and they won it. Was that one of their better ones? Was it better in comparison to everybody else? And so that's where you've got to make a decision. So then I guess the next part is to act on it. So if you don't have this information and you haven't oriented yourself for the data, how do you act after the race? And I just put a few different variables in here. So afterwards, when the athlete won, are they going to go, man, that was great? And you're going to go, yeah, that was great. You won the race. Everything's perfect. We're doing great. But even though that was, say, 10 watts below what they normally do, because you didn't have time to analyze it or orient it, or you haven't done it a number of times to know that this person's altitude bias at 9,000 feet is roughly, not bias, but altitude decrement is roughly, 10 watts at their threshold. Or do you say to the athlete, wait a second, let's see, we'll see how the powers are, good job for winning, or if they lost, it's okay, let's see where their powers were, and so on and so forth. And then you have the previous information. Do you act on that? Do you try to eliminate your bias and then create a training program? And then the expertise. I know I keep referring to expertise, but it's pretty common that if you try to coach someone in an area where you're not expert, you fail a lot, and then you create a lack of confidence in the athlete instead of just saying, I don't know. Saying something wrong is much worse analytically and emotionally than saying you don't know. So then the act part is, do you add an interval? Do you analyze the file? Do you analyze the athlete? What was the power in relationship to normalized power, TSS? And then that next observation starts right then. So then you go back and go, okay, what was the speed on the climb, and so on and so forth. And then we go back through the whole OODA loop thing, and you can go back to the decide portion and go back to observe. You can go to the act part. But each one of those is a decision, and I find if I go real slow and I'm at home by myself and I'm looking through these charts, it really helps me to observe the chart, decide what I'm, orient myself, because I need to know if that was the altitude or heat or power. And then I decide what I'm going to do, and then I act on it by saying you need to take a rest day or so on. That's the act part. So here's how a crude example, just to go through it one more time so we understand or so I understand really, is in the observe is say what is the athlete's FTP, what is the best previous mean maximal 20-minute power, what do you propose has been the change over time when you see it graphed out, what has been that change. And then one thing too, like simple things like how did they sleep, how hot is it. A lot of times we sit behind the computer and we look at these data, but we don't account for that observation. Then we got to orient it for how much volume of threshold, what are the powers for those conditions, what is the volume of FTP to get the change we want. Does 5 watts decide we have an adaptation? So then do we prescribe 3x20 at 250 watts at sea level for an hour and a half ride time duration? And then you act basically exactly what I said before. You just go through the whole thing again. So now we'll run through this now. So a couple just summary points on the OODA loop is that the ambiguity is good. You want that, and don't be afraid of it. The best way to succeed is to revel in kind of the insecurity, because once you understand that you're insecure and you wish you would have thought about this, thought about that, then you can put it in WKO4. So then you can do the altitude and the heat and the aerodynamics all at one shot, and then you can go to the next thing once you've analyzed what the influences of those environmental factors are. And when our circumstances change, we often fail to shift. So I know people that will always do a certain number of TSS and they will never come out of it, even though that TSS is maybe not right for every individual. Now you can actually see what's right for the individual and what has been a positive change or a prediction in performance. It is not necessarily the one with the most information who will become victorious. It's the one with the better judgment. So remember, the better judgment relies on the expertise. So you want to take the judgment of, say, Andy Coggan, if he's produced the FRC, the Pmax, and the model functional threshold power, and you don't quite understand it and you haven't dealt with it over time, then you want to use his judgment there. And then you want to use checklists and you want to use standards. But if you understand functional threshold power, then you want to use your judgment. And if you've had experience with it in relationship to 10-minute intervals get you that functional threshold power, then you want to use your information. We often observe imperfect or incomplete information. We're right now with WKO4, on my part, there's a lot of insecurity because I'm like, well, what is that? What if I do this? And so I'm trying, there's a lot of data to go through, and I'll give you a perfect example as we go on here through, or as we go on through the presentation. And then destructive deduction, that's the point of the pre-mortem. You want to figure out why you're wrong before you even institute something or where it can go wrong. And so then you want to validate the mental models right from the beginning, that if I do 3-minute intervals, what do I expect? Is it this much? And you're trying to analyze and predict what's going to happen before it happens and where you can go wrong. So here's how I did it. So this is the workout view. This isn't the athlete view, but the workout view. So a lot of people are looking at the matches and they're intrigued by how many matches do you burn versus the peaks in a race. So in this situation, it's the red is the greater than the peak 20-minute of the race. The black, which it may be a little bit hard to see, but the black is at the bottom, and that's less than the peak of the 20 minutes of the race. So I observe this, I'm looking at it, and I'm like, what am I going to do with this? I see where they went hard in red. I see where they went medium, basically yellow, and black is where they went easy. So now I say, okay, let's look at the last 40 of that ride. So I look at the last 40 kilometers of the race. Okay, so now I will highlight that portion and then look at it further. So now I've taken that and I've went from 20 minutes and now I've created of where were they greater than their best 3-minute power. Well, actually I went greater than their best 5-minute for the last 40K, but I did it with a 3-minute example in the graph. So what I did is I wanted to know where the 3-minute bests were, but I wanted to see it where in comparison to their best 5-minute power. That's the way I did it, because I wanted to expand where they went harder. So every time in red there is when they were above their best 5-minute power, but for the best 3-minute. And then I looked at a trend line for that. And the trend line is in yellow for power. The green line is their threshold power. So that gives me an example. So then when I look at that, so now I'm observing this again, I'm taking it down to a smaller notch. I'm looking, I forget who created this chart, but I'm looking at it and I'm saying, okay, how many times? Well, now I'm looking at it, I know they went above it, but for how much time and for how hard? So now these are just the questions that I'm just progressing, and then I just create charts to match my thought process. So now I go back to that file, I take the last 40K, I look at it, and I look at how much time they spent in the VO2 max range, because that's my 3-minute to 5-minute representation of what I consider VO2 max. So I go to time and level 5 I zones of the VO2, and that's 6%, which is roughly 10 minutes. And I looked at the time in the zones and the cog and optimized and the normalized power. And I went down to FRC, FTP, and FRC above FTP. So I took the 2 bars in purple at the bottom of this slide and the FRC, FTP, and FRC, and I looked at what time that was. And that gave me roughly 10 minutes. So then I looked at a race, I looked at the last 40K, I tried to find out how much time was spent above that 3 to 5 minutes of the last 40K in the race in VO2, and then I created a workout for it. So I know it had to be 10 minutes, so I used the BS art of coaching, and I said, well, maybe that I need about 20 minutes to get an adaptation. So then I created the same chart. And so again, in red is the peak powers above that 5-minute power. And then they just did 3 on, 3 off for, 6 times. So that's 18 minutes worth of work, where in the race they were about 10 minutes. So I figure I'm getting an overload in a rested situation. So that's all. I have no data to show you that that's correct or not. So that's what I need to figure out. And so then in the bottom, all the trend lines are trying to show me what the normal decline or rate of fatigue was throughout each interval. So if you can see the yellow line in the middle, that's the first interval, and then the preceding ones after that, where obviously fatigue was generated, now they're all about the same, and they kind of decline at the same slope. So that's how I went about it. So picked a race, try to see how many matches will burn, try to put a time frame to what the volume of time at VO2 was, then did a workout, guesstimated what time I needed for an adaptation, and then went further on and saw what the declines were. And then now I need to put in my mental model of what I expect to get from that. So that's one way. So now this is the athlete view. So that was the workout view, and this is the athlete view. So now I come back and I look at all those best 3-minute efforts. They're all in yellow. And then I look at the race, say it was the second to the last yellow dot, and then I look at the workout, which is the last yellow dot, and look at a comparison to what those were and within the interval. So then I did a trend, and then I put the bests to it and a trend line to where that fits within the seasons or years. This goes back to 2013 to 2016. And this is 5-minute powers. in red, so I look at that. Then I did a retrospective trend line. So now I'm not training anyone anymore. I'm looking back at the red line that goes through the whole. I know this is a busy chart, but that's the point. So I took a trend line, and then that is the intensity factor in red, and then the purple line is the volume. So as the intensity is increasing, the volume is decreasing. And so that, I'm showing you this because I'm cherry picking where I went right, or where I felt I went right, in doing a retrospective analysis of it. So we're still in the total athlete view. So then, if I would have known, this is what I came up with on my own, okay? By taking someone else's chart and adapting it to find out, hey, I should look at this over time to see if what I said I was doing in training was actually what was occurring. Now, this is what someone else has created, and I was like, man, this is way better to use this chronic intensity load, which is the blue line. So same principle is that now I see that the blue line stays the same or goes down in reference to where their chronic training load was years ago. So if you look to the left and where the kind of the turquoise bars are, their chronic training load is much higher, but there's only a few peaks of that chronic intensity load. And then you go over to now, since 2000, I didn't train this athlete during that time. I started training them in 2015. So then you start to see, okay, here's the chronic intensity load in the blue line, which is an estimate that takes the quality of the workout or the time that's done. So I've shortened the volume, and I've increased the intensity of whatever volume there was, and it's kind of stayed consistent. So if I would have had this chart or had that thought process, I could have looked at it much easier this way than my way of just taking in trend lines to intensity factors and so on. Okay, so this is how I observe. This is an observation one. This is where I created it. This is where new charts and new, this chart wasn't for what I just described it. I didn't look at this chart for that. And I think that's the lesson is we have these biases. I look at this chart. I've looked at performance manager charts for years, but now I look at it different because it has a different application in what I feel is important towards certain things now. So I still look at the yellow bars and the training stress balance and so on, but I also look at this other thing now in the CIL as more important for different trends over time. Now, I'm going to go through the kind of the last three things that I think are important when you're looking at or you're observing and you're orienting yourself within data. So I look at temperature. So red is the top 20 60-minute peaks and in what temperature they occurred, and the top 20 20-minute peaks and what temperature they occurred. And I know whether this person was adapted to heat or wasn't adapted to heat when they produced their best power. So I look at temperature. I look at elevation. And so that's a big thing because I have athletes that are all over at different elevations all the time, and I need to correct for that. Or else I would say 250 watts is 250 watts, but on that day it may have been 260, the value may have been 220, but the power could have been corrected to 260. And then I look at aerodynamics. This is one chart that Kevin helped create and Andy Coggin that I've worked with the spreadsheet of this for years, but basically what this chart is I've taken and corrected for whatever their average speed was during the time trial, what that average power for that average speed was. Then I correct it for 45K an hour and for 50K an hour to see what the given power would have been for that time. So then I can work on aerodynamics. And then here's I guess the last point, the last slide on retrospective is to find out if what you think is happening is happening. So once we had PMAX, FRC, and FTP, these are four athletes here, one from 2007 to 2014. And what I found for these particular athletes, all of them are either world champions or Grand Tour winners of the athletes that I trained, these four. And what I learned is that FRC wasn't that important and PMAX was even less important, but threshold is extremely. FTP was, and so I don't know why I even worried about some of that, because I thought I was worrying about it, but it just kept going down year after year after year, even though I thought maybe I was training it. But the results of these athletes kept going up year after year after year, but that was a function of their threshold power. So that's a retrospective analysis of some of that data. And that's it. So if you have anything, Tim, we can go from there.
Hey, Dean, great presentation. Sorry, I was on mute. If you guys want now to kind of type in some questions, I know that's a lot of information to absorb. Dean has an excellent process of management and really makes some really good points about how he coaches. For me, I'll just add a comment. I always try to stay out of the presentation. We've got some really great coaches on this meeting, so I bet you every coach on here has their process. The thing is with WKO4, what Dean is showing really well. Dean, can you go back one or two slides? I think, what I find, like, just leave there. That's fine as an example. It's like, look, I mean, be crystal clear. As the product leader, I'm always selling it to some degree, but only because I really believe in it. The thing is, right, the biggest challenge in WKO4, the change, and it's not just the change from WKO3 or Training Peaks, but it's what you're used to, is we're so used to looking at a report that somebody pre-designed and spending time saying, what did this report tell me? Where the new paradigm opens up a whole change, right? And it's tough. And that's why, Dean does such a great job of talking about bias and how it can impact you, because the new paradigm is you, instead of looking at a report and saying what does it tell me? You have to look at it. You don't have to actually. You can look at WKO4 and say, what do I want to know? One of the things Dr. Alan Lim did a presentation for us, and I think he had a great answer, and you really see it come to life in the way Dean uses it. Science and technology solve problems. They answer questions. They create solutions. And I think that's one, that really sticks with me. So when you look at this process, and Dean's OODA Loop, and OODA Loop is a very cool thing. Look it up, Google, search it, and spend some time. He really is saying, I have a process that ensures that everything I look at allows me to have a certain level of observation, a certain level of drill down. And what he's really doing is just like his first slide. He's using data to remove bias and saying, what am I really learning? So he then has spent some time. He's invested in time in developing the workflow that works for what he's looking for. One of the things I know that Dean does extensively as a pro coach, when you work with a lot of pros, pros race and train all over the world, and sometimes they're at 7,000 feet, and sometimes they're at 100 feet, and it really can be very challenging to track those. So sometimes they're in cold areas, sometimes they're in blazing hot areas. He has to, with so many pro athletes, take into account environmental effects. Like, one of the funniest things there is we've collected temperature for so long, right? But we never do anything with it. Suddenly you could build analytics that say, well, what's happening at temperature? What's happening here? Stuff like that. So one of the things, when I do in my private coaching company educations and stuff like that is develop a process as a coach that works for you. Dean's is good. I'm sure he would share charts with you and stuff like that, and we can get some of these. Some of these are up on ChartExchange. This one is not. This is the newest super chart, and he's actually comparing laps of aerodynamics, which is really cool. He's actually, and it's funny, he's not comparing aerodynamics. He's comparing the speed, which is the end result of aerodynamics. You as a coach, and more coaches, and it's funny, it's really happening. Watch our Facebook site, right? This person, that person, we're creating new analytics. The intensity, the CIL he's talking about, that, has been something worked on by a small group of coaches out in Boulder. Really just banging away and try to understand the impact of intensity. These doors are open, and that's part about creating a process. That's a good bad. That means it's going to take you 30 to 60 days was funny. Dean and I, when he first started, he cajoled. He never stole. I think he was giving, he was being
I will
overly,
steal any.
yeah, he cajoled, helped, asked, because he has great questions. He knows what he's looking for, so it's easy to support. Um, and he developed a workflow that now he has a very streamlined workflow. The technology does the work for him. He's not looking through a bunch of charts that mainly don't tell him what he wants to know and cherry picking information. He's got a workflow of designed reports that tells him exactly what he wants to know, and he gets through them quickly. It's actually reduced, but he paid the price. And that's the challenge of WKO4. You've got to absorb it. You got to know that it's going to take you 30 to 60 days to learn it. That's why we didn't make it consume WKO3. You know, like if you have a Microsoft product like Excel or Word, when you upgrade to 2016, it deletes 2013 and only gives you the option to use the new. We want you to have the option to use both so you can work through. So excellent demonstration of process, how he thinks, and then how Dean has used WKO4 to simply supply that process, automate it, and make it easy. All right, Dean, I got a couple of questions for you.
Okay.
And maybe these aren't for you or something like that. I haven't pre-vetted these last two. And you guys, if while I'm talking here, if you want to add your question, now is the time to ask it. Lucas asks, where are people sharing charts or asking questions about building charts? Group, Facebook, personal contacts. What good resources have people found? So Lucas, there's two resources, and I'm also going to tell you something we're going to do here very shortly. One, we have the Training Peaks Chart Exchange. So if you go to Training Peaks, WKO4, there's a link to the Chart Exchange. The Chart Exchange has about 20 charts up there. Some of them are general. Some of them are derived by Dr. Andy Coggin, Hunter Allen. Dean has one or two up there. Other coaches can, submit and put charts up there and do things. So there's some, pretty good charts to use up there. The reality is right now, because everything's very dynamic, like every time somebody shows a chart, somebody improves it, somebody does everything. Facebook, if you're not following us on Facebook, you're missing a tremendous amount of learning. We haven't started a WKO4 chart forum yet. I got to be honest with you, because to me, forums just turn into troll fests. So I avoid it. The thing about Facebook is it's easy to share charts, image, short hits, people grab it. Go to our Facebook site, like it now, and look back over the last 90 days. And you will see some really unique, really cool charts being exchanged. Next week, we're forming a combination of Facebook groups so that we can share easier on the Facebook site. And then within 3 to 4 weeks, we hope to have a new chart exchange, which is more dynamic and interactive for people launched and in place. And just ask. Dean can export these charts. Dean, if you don't mind sending me a couple of what you had there, if you don't mind sharing a couple, keep your super secret ones, but whatever works for you, and I can put them out after. So if you guys want some of these charts, just email me at tim@wko4.com and I'll send them. So Kyle has a question. And Dean, this is for you. Does a rider's phenotype sometimes predetermine the bias review and retrospective thought process?
Yes, but I don't care. So to be honest with you, I don't care about phenotype, because as a coach, when someone comes to you for training, once you initially maybe understand their phenotype or what a strength and weakness is and where they're going to respond, I just go to training. So there's an adage about sprinting or sprint training and running, is that I can't make you fast, but however you are, I will make you faster. So that's the way I look at it, is I'm just trying to make them better. And there's a number of ways to do that, for whether they have a phenotype as a time trialist or pursuitist. But obviously, if they're a sprinter and they're trying to do time trials, yeah, they're not going to be successful, but you can do lots of training to make them more successful than they would have been.
Yeah, Dean, I think that's a great answer. And Kyle points out phenotypes was in quotes. You're right. Yeah, Kyle, it is and it isn't. I can only give you my answer too, just to add on. It doesn't bias me. As a matter of fact, it eliminates some bias. by allowing me to, uh, and Dean actually said it there. To me, it's more of an overarching target type of deal. Like one of the things that phenotype gets me, it's like my early process of kind of, to me, when you're ever looking at an athlete, you have two questions you ask, period. Demand of the event, ability of the rider, right? That's where you start with everything. So phenotype gives me an immediate 20,000 foot view of the ability of the rider. And then Dean actually gave the exact example. It's like, here's a pure sprinter kind of phenotype wanting to win, an Ironman. Well, right off the bat, that gives me some understanding of the challenge. To me, that's not bias. That's actually removing bias. My bias might be anybody could do an Ironman and be successful, whereas the phenotype actually gives me that first very high level as I begin to drill down into that relationship.
I will say one more thing is that when we're in cycling, a lot of times in cycling and with data and the accuracy of the power meters and so on, we're so far ahead of many other sports. But in other sports, when you have a lot of people or a group and you want to quickly identify things to send to either a strength and conditioning coach, or then the phenotype is actually very useful because it just cuts out a lot of the um, work that you would have to do to analyze it, because you put in a bunch of data, you get a phenotype, you send them to the strength group. You get a phenotype, you send them to the power group, and then you send the other guy to the endurance group, and you have 3 groups. That's easy for phenotype for strength and conditioning or professional sports.
Yeah, that's actually a great answer. And Dean does work with different professional teams, so that's a really good answer. Okay, it looks like we've gotten through most of the questions. Everybody actually stayed on through the entire webinar. That's pretty cool. I will be posting the recorded version. You'll get a link. It'll be up on the Training Peaks site probably by later tomorrow afternoon. We really appreciate everybody coming. Dean, thank you so much for spending time with us. If you guys want to get the charts and links, just go ahead and send me an email, tim@wko4.com, and I will do it. One final point, if you use my email for questions of support, put in a support ticket because it will get lost in the black hole, which could be my email. So just put in a ticket. Because I give out my email a lot, people ask me for support here and there, and it gets lost. So just put in a ticket. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Dean. Everybody have a great night.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good night now.